So as we begin this process, we're going to hear about numbers. If you know me, you probably don't think that I love numbers, but I do. I am all about digging into the numbers and how do we change them and what do they mean and where do we go from here based on what the numbers are telling us. And there is nobody who loves numbers more than Allison. Allison Corbyn is an amazing person who digs into the data and tells us what she means or what it means. So I absolutely admire her and I'm anxious for her to tell us about the coordination response and kind of our economic roller coaster. And she's going to be joined by Andy Zoeller. So Allison, please take it away and tell us about the numbers.
All right, thank you, Karen. So to give context to where we've been in the last several months since March, we always like to start of where we were coming from, so where things started. We like to reflect on what was happening before we went into the COVID-19 economic disruptions. So prior to that, we always do this economic pulse evaluation where we look at economic and data trends that we need to have our eyes on, especially as we relate to peer communities. And so some of the challenges we knew that 40% of our workforce would reach or exceed retirement age in 10 years. We knew that 22% of our workforce currently is 65 years old. We also knew that our GDP had finally just reached a point where we exceeded the 2015 GDP, which was good. We were really pretty a strong economy going into the COVID-19 disruption. And then our median household income kind of is one of those factors we like to keep our eye on because we kind of trail our peer communities in wages. And so this just gives us a little backdrop of some of the opportunities and challenges that we saw going into 2019 or 2020, some strengths, some weaknesses. But then, as we all know, the COVID-19 disruption really hit us. And the four factors that we really like to think about when we are walking through what economic impact has occurred in our community and what we need to be paying attention to really come down to economic production. So that's one, economic production and business activity as a whole. The second is employment. So what are employment numbers and trends doing? Consumer behavior, and finally, community health. And so when we look at those factors, there are factors that are leading economic indicators and some that are lagging. So what we all wish we could look at today is, what is our GDP doing and what is the activity occurring there? And that's not a number that we'll have for another pretty much a year after it occurs. And so that kind of bottlenecks us. So what we did is tried to get at that with some local community data that Andy was able to compile. Factors. When we were looking at, when this first happened, we were turning to an economic analysis firm that really looked at the vulnerability of counties throughout the nation. And some of you may have heard this before, but Yellowstone County is in the top 10% of most vulnerable counties. And that comes from the fact that we are really a regional hub. So many people come to our community for things like professional services, for recreation, for hospitality. So we are more vulnerable than some of our peer communities. And it's something that we're keeping our eye on because 7 of the 10 most vulnerable communities or vulnerable industries are ones that have a really high concentration in our market. So 7 of the 10 that you see on this list, we have a higher concentration than the United States average. So we're just keeping our eye on all these industries and seeing what's occurring from both an employment perspective and also from just general economic activity. So that's one of the large scale factors we can look at when we're looking at our economy, but I'll turn it to Andy to give you an idea of some of the local data that tells the story of what our economy is doing.
Thanks, Allison. The city monitors a few, I would say, indices that to try to track what's happening locally in the city of Billings. One of these is new construction and building activity. The chart there shows 2020 compared to 2019 building permit activity and construction valuation. We've been monitoring this because construction and property values really drive property tax revenue at the city and funding services. So we keep a close eye on this throughout the year pretty regularly. And what you'll see actually was building permit activity was a little bit higher in 2020 compared to 2019. However, that's almost that difference is almost fully in residential permits. still kind of slow activity in commercial, but it was actually pretty heavy residential construction this year compared to last year. You can go to the next slide. This here is our business license activity. This one we started watching right at the beginning of the pandemic, anticipating that the business activity would really slow down. And it did in April, and we didn't see a lot of new business license application, but it did actually pick back up, I think, through the summer. I'm trying to pull it, okay. And when comparing 2019 to 2020, we're pretty well spot on total new businesses through the year, just under 700 new business license applications. We also track renewals, which we don't have a slide for, but I'll kind of talk through that. So as annually businesses renew their licenses, I wanted to watch that as well to see if we saw a big decline in the number of renewals, indicating, loss of business in our community. Fortunately, we didn't see a lot of that. From March through the end of November, we had about 4,300 renewals in 2019, and for 2020, about 4,200. So a little bit less, but I wouldn't say it's a significant margin. And then the next slide, the final thing that we've been tracking at the city has been the number of employments. This really correlates to our hospitality industry. Because we don't have sales tax, there's not a lot of ways for us at the city to track spending activity. But we know that travel had declined for the city, or all nationally, and that's evidenced here. Our employments are down quite a bit compared to the prior year. We are sitting at right now about 50–60% of what we have had historically. And as you can see on the chart there, in April, it was almost down to nothing. I think it was just 2,500 passengers through our airport. Pretty small when compared to years prior. And that certainly had an impact on our hospitality industries. And I think that's all I have. Yeah. Allison?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. And I think it was interesting too, just talking with Kevin Plone, the airport director today, that while our community is at 60% of what it was in the same year or in the same month, the US average is really more around 30%. So we're doing double what you see other communities throughout the nation doing. So that's encouraging for our market, and the state of Montana as a whole has done well through, as far as recovery is concerned, and employments for, and a lot of it was tourism driven. So this next slide has a lot of numbers on it, but this is still looking at that whole picture of what is our economy doing. And just a few quick things. We like to track how much money actually came into our community to support businesses. We feel like the more money you can get driven into our community, the better we'll do. So you'll see we got 14% of the state awarded funds were awarded into Yellowstone County. That's at $88 million. We peaked at 9,600 people filing unemployment claims, now down to 2,500 people filing unemployment claims. And in a recent survey by the chamber, the concern about COVID is still out there. They said nearly 50% of businesses reported that they're concerned if things don't improve when it comes to COVID-19 infections, that they may have to reduce staff or operations. So this just kind of gives us a picture of what's happening in the economy as a whole when we don't have the data like GDP available. So I'll kind of zip through this. Once we get out of general economy, we look at employment, and that tells a strong story because employment data is collected on a more regular basis than you see general economic data collected. And what I want to just highlight here is just the peak that you can see in that really tall line that shoots up in mid-April. It peaked. That top line is leisure industry. So of the unemployment insurance claims filed at the peak of our unemployment time because of COVID, nearly 30% were from the leisure industry. So that includes hospitality, food, restaurants, and tourism, travel. So you can see that industry was dramatically more impacted than the rest. The second line there that you see, that's the next down, is actually self-employed. So self-employed folks filing for unemployment. So I just think that gives you a picture of what area of our community was hit the hardest. When we look at trends of unemployment insurance claims, I put a side-by-side with the United States. This is most recent data, came out on December 5th as far as unemployment in the United States versus unemployment in Yellowstone County. And you can see that the trend is relatively similar. I tried to stretch out the chart a little bit so you could have an equal picture. But as you can see, you know, we are actually perhaps even getting closer to where we were before COVID-19 disruption, but you could see that spike occurred and we've been traveling down ever since. You do see a little turn up at the end of that chart, but that's really related to seasonality that you would expect in a normal year anyway. With, you know, it's getting colder, construction type folks, you know, are starting to file unemployment because the season is over for them. So you have all of that seasonality is pretty typical. So, and when we look at this information, we also look at how many jobs are available in our community today. And there are about 3,000 postings in our community today telling us that there's more job postings than there are people filing unemployment insurance. There might be gaps in skills and abilities, but we do know that jobs still exist in our economy. Finally, we would like to track the consumer spending. We know in Montana, spending is down 9.4%. We don't have a local Yellowstone County data point on that, but we're watching that closely because that's consumer confidence, consumer willingness to spend money is going to be critical to our recovery. And that's why we're always saying, you know, shop local, keep your cheer here. And so that rounds out the slides that I have today. But the final point that we talk about is just how well we like to keep track of what's happening with community health, because community health will be a huge driver in how consumers engage and how we continue to recover from the economic disruption.